Ethan Carter never expected that the stranded stranger whose vintage Cadillac he repaired for free would turn out to be the President of the United States. With his family's century-old farm drowning in debt and facing foreclosure in 30 days, Ethan watched in disbelief as a presidential motorcade rolled up their dusty driveway. 3 weeks later, President Thomas Mitchell hadn't forgotten the humble mechanic who refused payment for fixing his prized 1957 Cadillac Eldorado during an unscheduled, undercover road trip through America's heartland. What happened next would transform not only the Carter family's desperate situation, but also the future of Harvestville itself. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Ethan Carter's shoulders as he worked beneath the hood of the ancient tractor at the edge of their withering cornfield. At 25, his hands already bore the calluses and tiny scars of a lifetime spent repairing farm equipment. His strong frame and sun-broned skin spoke of daily physical labor. But it was his eyes that revealed his true nature, observant, intelligent, and filled with the quiet determination that had kept Carter Farm running, long after their neighbors had sold out to corporate agriculture. "Come on, you stubborn piece of," Ethan muttered as he carefully adjusted the timing belt. The tractor had broken down 3 times this month already, and parts for the 40-year-old machine were becoming nearly impossible to find. He'd fabricated this particular piece himself, hammering it into shape in the farm's workshop, using skills passed down from his grandfather from the nearby farmhouse. The screen door slammed and Ethan's father Robert emerged, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, a permanent reminder of the accident 2 years ago that had left the older Carter with a damaged hip and even more damaged pride. At 58, Robert Carter's weathered face carried the lines of decades spent battling droughts, floods, fluctuating crop prices, and now crushing medical debt. "Any luck?" Robert called, his voice carrying across the dusty yard. Ethan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. Almost there, should have her running in time for the irrigation. If there was enough water for irrigation, Ethan thought, but didn't say the spring had been unusually dry and their outdated system couldn't compete with the sophisticated setups used by the corporate farms that had gradually surrounded their 180 acres of family-owned land. The Carters were among the last independent farmers in Harvestville, a distinction that brought more pride than profit. Ethan watched as his father made his slow way to the small wooden bench beneath the ancient oak tree that had stood sentinel over Carter Farm since his great-grandfather had built the first house on the property in 1918. The man who had once managed every aspect of their operation now spent most days watching from the sidelines, his inability to work the land himself eating away at him more painfully than his physical injuries. "Mail came," Robert said as Ethan approached, holding out a handful of envelopes, including one with the First National Bank logo prominently displayed. Ethan took the mail, his stomach nodding as he recognized the bank's envelope. He slipped that particular piece into his back pocket without opening it. The contents would be the same as last month and the month before. "Final notice payment due, foreclosure imminent." "I'll look at it later," he said, sitting beside his father on the bench. From this vantage point they could see most of their property, the cornfield to the east struggling in the drought, the empty cattle pastures they'd been forced to sell off last year, and the small orchard his mother had planted before cancer took her 4 years ago. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Sarah called this morning," Robert said, referring to Ethan's younger sister who'd escaped farm life for medical school 3 years ago. "She wants to defer her final semester and come home to help." Ethan shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. She's 6 months away from finishing her clinical rotations. That's her ticket to a stable future. This farm is her heritage too." Robert countered, though without much conviction. They'd had this argument before, and deep down, both men knew Ethan was right. Sarah's future shouldn't be sacrificed for a farm that was likely beyond saving. "Heritage doesn't pay student loans," Ethan replied, softening the words with a gentle pat on his father's shoulder. "I promised Mom I'd make sure. Sarah finished school and I meant it." The truth neither of them spoke aloud was that Carter Farm had been struggling long before Robert's Small family operations like theirs had been disappearing across America for decades, unable to compete with industrial-scale agriculture. Robert's medical bills only, partially covered by their bare bones, insurance had merely accelerated the inevitable slide toward foreclosure. Ethan had taken over day-to-day operations after his father's accident, working from dawn until well past dusk, taking odd jobs, repairing equipment for other farmers when he could find the time, and teaching himself newer farming techniques from borrowed textbooks. His mechanical aptitude had always been extraordinary. A gift his grandfather had called it. Ethan could diagnose and fix almost any engine by ear alone, a talent that had saved them thousands in repair costs over the years. But talent alone couldn't overcome crippling debt, outdated equipment, and the harsh realities of modern agricultural economics. The bank had granted them extension after extension, primarily due to the Carter family's long history in the community. But their patience had finally run out. They had 30 days to make a payment that might as well have been $1 million for all their ability to produce it. Ethan stood unable to sit still when there was work to be done. "I'll finish the tractor, then head over to check the irrigation and pump on the east field forecast. Says no rain again this week." Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where massive grain silos belonging to Heartland Agricultural Corporation rose like modern castles. The corporate farm had been buying up failing family operations for the past decade, offering prices well below market value to desperate farmers who had no other options. Their representative had already made 2 visits to Carter Farm in the past month, each time increasing their insultingly low offer slightly, but never to anything approaching fair value. "Miller sold to them last week," Robert said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the gentle breeze. "His place has been in their family since before ours." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy mixed with determination. The Millers had been their neighbors and friends for generations. "We're not the Millers," he said with more confidence than he felt. Before Robert could respond, the distant sound of an engine in distress caught Ethan's attention. His head turned automatically toward the county road that ran along their property, his ear identifying the problem immediately: a car with ignition timing issues, probably a classic model from the way it sounded. Sure enough, an unfamiliar vintage Cadillac had pulled to the side of the road about a 4-mile down, blue smoke puffing from its exhaust. Even from this distance, Ethan could tell it was a beauty. A 1957 Eldorado, if he wasn't mistaken, one of the crown jewels of American automotive design. "Someone's having a bad day," Robert observed, following his son's gaze. Ethan glanced at the waiting tractor, mentally calculating how much time he could spare. The stranger was unlikely to find help anytime soon. The nearest repair service was in Mill Creek, 40 mi away, and notoriously backed up this time of year. "I'll be back in an hour," he said, already heading toward the workshop to grab his toolbox. "That timing isn't going to fix itself." Robert smiled slightly, a glimmer of the man he'd been before the accident. "Some things never change. You've been fixing strangers' vehicles since you were 12. Ethan shrugged as he hefted his heavy toolbox. "Everyone needs help sometimes." As he made his way down the dusty driveway toward the stranded car, Ethan had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness, one of thousands he'd performed throughout his life without expectation of reward, would set in motion events that would change everything for the Carter family and their struggling farm. The Cadillac looked even more impressive up close, its turquoise and white two-tone paint gleaming in the summer sun despite the blue smoke continuing to billow from the exhaust. This was no ordinary classic car, but a meticulously maintained piece of automotive history, the kind that usually only appeared at high-end car shows or in museum collections. A man in his early 60s stood beside the Cadillac, staring at the engine with a frustrated expression. Unlike the typical classic car enthusiasts Ethan occasionally encountered, this stranger wasn't dressed in vintage clothing or specialized gear. He wore simple khaki pants and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, both showing signs of travel. His hands were those of someone who wasn't afraid of honest work, with calluses that spoke of practical experience rather than pampered wealth. "Timing problems," Ethan called as he approached, setting down his heavy toolbox. The man looked up, surprise and relief washing over his features. "Yes, exactly, though I'm impressed you could tell from a distance." Ethan shrugged. The blue smoke and that particular coughing sound are pretty distinctive. I'm Ethan Carter, he added, extending his hand. My family's farm is just up the road, Tom Mitchell. The man replied, shaking Ethan's hand with a firm grip. And I can't tell you how glad I am to see you cell service. Out here is non-existent, and I was beginning to think I'd be walking back to Town's 15 me that way. Ethan said, gesturing down the road, and it's supposed to hit 95 today. Not a great day for a hike. He circled the Cadillac, his experienced eye taking in details. This is a 57L. Eldorado, right. Beautiful machine. Mitchell nodded, seeming pleased by Ethan's recognition. Yes, though at the moment, beautifully useless. I was on a little road trip when it started smoking and died on me. Mind if I take a look? Ethan asked, already selecting a wrench from his toolbox. Please do, Mitchell replied with evident relief. I know enough about classics to appreciate them, but not nearly enough to fix them when they act up like this. As he suspected, the timing was off and there were signs of minor neglect that suggested the car had recently been taken out of long-term storage. These weren't problems that required sophisticated diagnostic equipment, just an ear tuned to the subtle language of engines and hands that knew exactly how to coax them back to life. When was the last time you had her running regularly? Ethan asked as he worked to adjust the distributor. It's been sitting in a garage for about 2 years, Mitchell admitted, watching Ethan work with evident interest. I recently decided life's too short to keep her hidden away. Thought a cross-country drive might be good for both of us. Unlike many vehicle owners, Ethan had helped over the years. Mitchell didn't hover anxiously or offer unwanted advice. Instead, he asked occasional intelligent questions that revealed a solid understanding of mechanical principles, if not the specific application to classic cars. You're remarkably skilled for someone so young, Mitchell commented as Ethan carefully adjusted the carburetor after fixing the timing. Where did you learn to work on engines like this? My grandfather, mostly, Ethan replied, focusing on properly gauging the fuel mixture. He could fix anything. With an engine, Syed, it was about listening as much as looking. Machines tell you what's wrong if you know how to hear them. He smiled at the memory. My father continued the tradition, teaching me from the time I could hold a wrench. Now I handle all our repairs plus help out neighbors when I can. And yet you dropped everything to help a complete stranger, Mitchell observed thoughtfully. Ethan shrugged again, uncomfortable with the implied praise. It's what people do around here or used to anyway. Communities changed a lot in recent years. How so? Mitchell asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp with interest. Ethan hesitated, rarely one to discuss local problems with outsiders, but something about Mitchell's genuine interest broke through his usual reserve. As he continued working on the Cadillac, Ethan found himself explaining the situation facing small farmers in Harvestville, the drought conditions, predatory buying practices of corporate farms, rising costs and falling crop prices that had driven most family operations to the brink of extinction. My family's farm is one of the last independent operations of our size in the county, he concluded as he finished the repair, wiping his hands on a shop rag. And honestly, we're hanging on by a thread. Mitchell's expression had grown increasingly thoughtful as Ethan spoke. That's the story across much of rural America. Unfortunately, the system seems designed to eliminate operations like yours, despite small farms being vital to sustainable agricultural practices in rural communities. Something in his tone made Ethan look up sharply. This wasn't the typical platitude offered. By sympathetic outsiders, Mitchell spoke with the conviction of someone who understood the issue deeply. You sound like you've given this some thought, Ethan observed, closing his toolbox. Mitchell smiled slightly. More than some. It's actually a personal interest of mine, finding ways to preserve America's agricultural heritage while making family farms economically viable again. Before Ethan could inquire further about this intriguing statement, Mitchell glanced at his watch. I'm already late for my meeting. How much do I owe you for the repair? Ethan waved away the question. Nothing. Took less than an hour and just needed adjustments, not parts. You're certain? Mitchell pressed, reaching for his wallet. Your time has value, especially when you've got your own equipment waiting for repair. Consider it Harvestville hospitality, Ethan insisted, hefting his toolbox. Just doing what my father and grandfather would have done. Mitchell studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, Ethan. That kind of principle seems increasingly rare these days. He climbed into the Cadillac's plush interior, then paused. Would you mind if I stopped by your farm on my way? Back through, I'd like to see your operation if that wouldn't be an imposition. The request surprised Ethan. Most outsiders showed little genuine interest in small farms except as potential acquisition targets. Sure, if you want nothing special to see. Just a family trying to hang on to what our great-grandfather built. Sometimes that's the most special thing of all. Mitchell replied with unexpected earnestness. He started the Cadillac, which now purred smoothly without a trace of smoke, which place is yours, Carter Farm. About half a mile up this road, white farmhouse with a red barn, big oak tree in the front yard. Can't miss it, Carter. Mitchell repeated thoughtfully. I'll remember that. Thank you again. Ethan. As the Cadillac pulled away, Ethan watched until it disappeared around a bend in the road. There had been something different about Tom Mitchell, a genuineness that stood in stark contrast to the corporate representatives who regularly visited failing farms with their clipboards and lowball offers. He seemed to actually care about the challenges facing small farmers, which was refreshing, if ultimately meaningless to the Carter's dire situation. Ethan walked back to Carter Farm under the increasingly brutal summer sun, his thoughts already returning to the tractor waiting for repair and the irrigation system that needed attention before nightfall. Tom Mitchell and his beautiful Cadillac were an interesting diversion, but distractions wouldn't save the farm from foreclosure. Only a miracle could do that. And Ethan had stopped believing in miracles around the same time his mother died, and his father's accident had left them drowning in medical debt. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The week following Ethan's encounter with Tom Mitchell unfolded with the grim predictability of a slow-motion disaster. Each day brought the Carters closer to the bank's foreclosure deadline, a countdown Ethan felt with physical discomfort. Each morning he awoke. The stranger in his vintage Cadillac quickly faded from memory as the urgent realities of farm life demanded every ounce of Ethan's attention. Days after fixing Mitchell's car, the aging irrigation pump serving their east field failed completely. Ethan spent 14 hours straight trying to resurrect the ancient system, working well past midnight by the harsh illumination of portable work lights. By dawn, he'd managed a temporary fix that would keep the struggling corn crop hydrated, but the solution wouldn't last beyond a week. Replacement parts for the 30-year-old system were nearly impossible to find, and a new pump would cost thousands. They simply didn't have. On Friday morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before him, a calculator and a dwindling cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The numbers hadn't changed from yesterday or the day before, but he kept reworking them as if through sheer mathematical persistence he might discover some overlooked solution. The farm's checking account held barely enough to cover another week of operating expenses. Their line of credit was maxed out. The payment required by First National Bank to stop foreclosure proceedings was nearly $78,000, an impossible sum representing 2 years of missed mortgage payments, accumulated interest and penalties. You're going to wear a hole in that paper, Robert observed as he entered the kitchen, moving slowly, with his cane. The early morning hours were always worst for his pain before medication took effect and his damaged body warmed up. Ethan sighed, pushing away the calculator, just trying to make sense of it. Robert eased himself into a chair across from his son, his eyes still sharp. Despite everything his body had endured, took in the scattered bills with a farmer's practiced assessment of poor conditions. Some things don't make sense no matter how many times you count them. I've been thinking about that offer from Heartland, Ethan said, carefully watching his father's reaction. The one they made last month. Robert's expression hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. You mean their insult 60 cents on the dollar for land that's been in this family for over a century? It would clear the bank debt, Ethan pointed out, playing devil's advocate against his own instincts, with enough left to get you that hip replacement the specialist recommended. Maybe even help Sarah with her final semester's tuition. And then what? Robert challenged, his voice quiet but intense. Where would we live? What would we do? Farming is all I know. I could find mechanic work. Ethan suggested, though, the idea of spending his days in some sterile garage rather than under the open sky made his chest tighten. There's that new automotive restoration facility in Mill Creek. They're always looking for people who understand vintage engines. Robert reached across the table, covering one of Ethan's calloused hands with his own son. I know you're carrying the weight of this, have been since my accident, but selling to Heartland isn't the answer. They're vultures circling what they think is already dead. Maybe we are dead, Dad? Ethan said, voicing the fear that had been growing inside him for months, just too stubborn to lie down. Robert shook his head firmly. Carters don't quit. Your great-grandfather survived the Dust Bowl on this land. Your grandfather weathered 2 years of crop failure during the '56 drought. I held on through the farm crisis of the '80s, when interest rates hit 18%. We'll find a way. The absolute conviction in his father's voice awakened Ethan's childhood belief that his father could solve any problem, fix any crisis. But the adult Ethan knew the harsh reality of their situation. This wasn't weather or interest rates or even bad luck. This was a systemic transformation of American agriculture that had been grinding small family farms into dust for decades, an economic wood chipper that no amount of Carter's stubbornness could overcome. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp knock at the kitchen door interrupted their conversation. Martha Sullivan, their nearest neighbor, and the widow of Robert's childhood friend, stood on the porch, her expression unusually somber for the normally cheerful 76-year-old morning Martha. Robert called, beckoning her inside. Coffee is hot, and for once Martha entered but waved away the offer of coffee. Can't stay. Just came to warn you boys, Heartland's people are making the rounds again today. 2 black SUVs just pulled up at the Thompson place down the road. Thought you'd want to prepare yourselves. Ethan and Robert exchanged a look of weary resignation. Heartland Agricultural Corporation had perfected a strategy of concentrated pressure on holdout farmers. They would visit multiple families in the same area on the same day, creating a sense of inevitability as neighbors watched each other consider the corporation's offers. Thanks for the warning, Ethan said, already gathering the bills into a neat stack. No sense letting Heartland's representatives see their financial disarray. Any idea who they've sent this time? That same smooth-talking fellow from Chicago, Anderson or Adamson something. Like that, Martha replied with evident distaste. And some new woman dressed like she's never set foot on real dirt in her life. Robert snorted. Probably hasn't. They grow them in labs at those corporate headquarters programmed to save fair market value, while offering half that. Martha's expression softened as she looked between the 2 Carter men. They'll be here within the hour. I expect you want me to stick around. I can be mighty unpleasant when I put my mind to it. Might help them keep their visit short. Ethan smiled at the offer. At 5'3", Martha Sullivan wasn't physically imposing, but her sharp tongue and unwavering stare had been known to make even the most persistent salesman retreat. In discomfort, we'll handle it, Robert assured her. But maybe check back this afternoon, might need your apple pie to restore our spirits. After Martha departed with promises to return later, Ethan and Robert prepared for the unwelcome visitors. Ethan changed his oil-stained work shirt for a clean one, while Robert moved to his customary position on the front porch, a strategic location that would allow him to greet Heartland's representatives on his terms, rather than struggling to rise when they arrived. What's our position today? Ethan asked as he joined his father on the porch, the morning sun already heating the summer air to uncomfortable levels. Robert's gaze was fixed on the distant horizon where his crops struggled against the drought. Same as yesterday, not selling, not to Heartland, not to anyone. Ethan nodded, respecting his father's determination, while silently acknowledging the mathematical impossibility of their situation. The bank's deadline was just 23 days away. Without a miracle, Carter Farm would be auctioned off, regardless of the Carter's wishes likely ending up in Heartland's possession anyway. But with the Carters receiving nothing for generations of sweat equity and stewardship, precisely 40 minutes after Martha's warning, 2 black SUVs with Illinois license plates turned into the Carters' long driveway, kicking up dust as they made their way toward the farmhouse. Ethan felt his jaw tighten involuntarily at the sight. Heartland never sent two vehicles unless they were preparing to apply maximum pressure. The SUVs parked. With military precision, and three individuals emerged. Two men in expensive suits despite the heat, and a woman with a tablet computer. The men's polished shoes were immediately coated with the fine dust of the farmyard, a detail that gave Ethan a small measure of satisfaction. Mr. Carter called the lead man a tall figure with carefully styled silver hair and the artificial tan of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than Field's Richard Anderson Heartland Agricultural Corporation. "We spoke last month. Hope you don't mind us stopping by again. Seems like you'd have stopped by regardless of my feelings on the matter," Robert observed dryly, not rising from his chair. "Since you're already here, might as well come up and say whatever." "You came to say," Anderson maintained his corporate smile as he and his colleagues approached the porch. "This is my associate, Miss Hammond, our regional acquisition specialist," he said, gesturing to the polished woman with the tablet, "and our legal counsel, Mr. Perez." "What can we do for you today, Mr. Anderson?" Robert asked, deliberately skipping the social niceties that might make the corporate visitors feel welcome. Anderson stepped forward smoothly, taking control of the conversation. "Mr. Carter, in light of our continuing interest in your property and our awareness of your upcoming financial obligations, Heartland is prepared to make a revised offer for Carter. Farm one that would satisfy your outstanding obligations to First National Bank and provide a modest relocation allowance." Ms. Hammond tapped her tablet and spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to closing deals. "Our revised offer represents a significant improvement over our previous proposal. 70% of assessed land value with an expedited closing process that would resolve your bank obligations before foreclosure proceedings become public record." She extended the tablet toward Ethan, displaying a document with numbers that, while still insultingly below true market value, would indeed clear their debt and leave something, though not much, to start over elsewhere. "We're aware of your father's medical situation," Anderson added with practiced sympathy that never reached his eyes. "This offer would provide sufficient funds for proper care while avoiding the public embarrassment of foreclosure. Heartland would also consider a leaseback arrangement for the homestead portion, allowing you to remain in the family home for up to 12 months during transition." The cold calculation behind their approach, using Robert's health and their financial desperation as leverage, made Ethan's blood boil before he could respond with the fury building inside him. Robert's calm voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Anderson, I appreciate you driving all the way from Chicago to deliver this wonderful offer." Robert said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "But I told you last month and the month before that Carter Farm is not for sale, not to Heartland, not to anyone." Anderson's professional facade cracked slightly, revealing the frustration beneath. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, you don't appear to understand your situation. First National Bank will foreclose in 3 weeks. You'll lose everything with nothing to show for it." 3 weeks is a lot of time for a farmer," Robert replied evenly. "We've faced worse." Odds the legal counsel finally spoke up, his tone more conciliatory than his colleagues. "Mr. Carter, I understand your attachment to your property. But the economic realities?" "The economic reality," Ethan interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer, "is that corporations like yours have systematically undermined small farming operations for decades. You manipulate markets' pressure, local governments for favorable regulations, and then swoop in to buy distressed properties at a fraction of their worth. That's not business, it's predation." Anderson's expression hardened as he realized the Carters wouldn't be intimidated or charmed into submission. "Very well. Our offer remains open until the end of the week. After that, we'll proceed with arrangements to bid at the foreclosure auction." He handed Ethan a business card. "Call me when you reconsider. Rural stubbornness makes for great country songs, Mr. Carter, but it's a poor financial strategy." As the Heartland representatives returned to their vehicles, Ethan remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, until the dust from their departing SUVs settled on the driveway. Only then did he turn to his father, the defiance that had animated Robert's features during the confrontation having faded, leaving behind the tired face of a man fighting battles on too many fronts, his failing body, his struggling farm, and the relentless economic forces aligned against both. You still believe what you said? Ethan asked quietly. About finding a way? Robert's eyes remained fixed on the horizon where his fields, his life's work stretched toward an uncertain future. I have to, son. The moment I stopped believing, it's truly over. Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder, feeling the prominent bones beneath the worn cotton shirt. Robert had lost weight in recent months, his body consuming itself, as surely as their financial reserves had been depleted. How much of his father's stubborn refusal to sell was principle, and how much was simply the inability to imagine any other life? I need to check the irrigation system, Ethan said finally, the farm's never-ending demands pulling him back to immediate concerns. That temporary fix won't hold much longer. As he walked toward the equipment barn, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Heartland's representatives returning in 3 weeks to claim their farm at auction. Their victory assured by the Carters' refusal to surrender on more favorable terms. Pride was a luxury they could ill afford, yet it seemed to be the only thing they had left in abundance. The next several days passed in a blur of desperate work and mounting frustration. Ethan spent every waking moment battling the farm's deteriorating equipment, his determination increasing in direct proportion to their dwindling hopes. The temporary fix on the irrigation system failed after just 4 days, forcing him to implement an even more makeshift solution, using parts salvaged from abandoned equipment he'd found in Martha's old barn. As he worked, Ethan replayed the confrontation with Heartland and the bank in his mind, searching for options they might have overlooked. Each mental review ended at the same impasse without nearly $80. In the next 2 weeks, Carter Farm would be lost. No amount of mechanical ingenuity or farming skill could generate that kind of money from failing crops and outdated equipment. Thursday afternoon, as Ethan struggled to repair a broken belt on their ancient combine harvester, his cell phone rang. The screen showed his sister Sarah's name, and he hesitated before answering. Sarah was in her final year of medical school, and Ethan had deliberately minimized the severity of their situation in their weekly conversations, not wanting to distract her from her studies. "Hey, Sar," he answered, attempting to sound upbeat as he wiped sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "How's school, Ethan?" Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "Mrs. Thompson called me. She said Heartland was at the farm last week with their acquisition team." "Is it true? Are we losing the farm?" Ethan sighed, leaning against the Combine Trust, the town's most devoted gossip, to make sure everyone knew everyone else's business. "It's complicated, sir. We're having some cash flow issues, but Dad and I are handling it." "Don't lie to me," Sarah said sharply. "I called First National Bank pretending to be interested in properties coming up for auction. They have Carter Farm listed for foreclosure in 2 weeks. Why didn't you tell me it had gotten this bad?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, guilt washing over him. At 22, Sarah was the youngest of the Carter children and the only one who'd shown interest in a life beyond farming. He and Robert had agreed to shield her from their financial troubles, wanting her to focus on building her future rather than being dragged down by the farm's problems. "We didn't want you to worry," he admitted. "You're so close to finishing your degree. Sir, Dad and I both agreed your education had to be the priority. So you, too, decided to lose our family's legacy without even telling me." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "That farm is my heritage too, Ethan. I know, sir, I'm sorry." Ethan ran a hand through his dirt-streaked hair. "But what could you have done? Your tuition savings wouldn't make a dent in what we owe, and we'd never ask you to sacrifice your future for this place." There was a long silence on the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less determined. "I'm coming home this weekend. I have some ideas we should discuss." "Sarah, there's no point I'm coming, Ethan," she interrupted firmly. "And I'm bringing Professor Jenkins from the Agricultural Economics Department. He's been working with struggling family farms as part of his research. At least hear what he has to say before you give up hope." And resentment weared in Ethan's chest. On one hand, any potential solution deserved consideration with their deadline looming so close. On the other, the thought of some academic professor coming to lecture them on farming, something the Carters had done successfully for generations until the deck became so thoroughly stacked against small operations, rankled his pride. "Dad's not going to be receptive to someone telling him how to farm his own land," Ethan warned. "Dad doesn't have to be receptive," Sarah replied with a hint of the Carter stubbornness they all shared. "He just has to listen." "We'll arrive Friday evening, please, Ethan." Just hear what Professor Jenkins has to say before you dismiss it. After ending the call with Sarah, Ethan returned to the broken combine with renewed determination. If they were going to entertain last-minute solutions, they needed to at least maintain the appearance of a functioning farm. The perversity of the situation wasn't lost on him, working frantically to keep equipment operational for crops they might never harvest on land they likely wouldn't own in 2 weeks. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the struggling fields, Ethan heard the sound of a vehicle turning into their driveway. Assuming it was Martha returning, as promised with her famous apple pie, he was surprised to see a sleek black town car he didn't recognize approaching the house. The vehicle wasn't like Heartland's corporate SUVs, but its polished appearance seemed equally out of place in their dusty farmyard. Curious and slightly wary after the confrontation with Heartland's representatives, Ethan set down his tools and walked toward the house, wiping his greasy hands on an old rag. As he approached, the town car's driver's door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out, scanning the surroundings with alert eyes that immediately struck Ethan as professional military or law enforcement, perhaps. The man nodded politely to Ethan but said nothing as he opened the rear passenger door. From the back seat emerged a familiar figure that stopped Ethan in his tracks. Tom Mitchell, the stranger whose Cadillac he'd repaired the previous week, stepped out into the evening light. But where before he had seemed like a simple traveler in casual clothes, now he wore a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of significant wealth or position. "Ethan," Mitchell called warmly, approaching with his hand extended. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by as promised. I mentioned I wanted to see your operation." "Mr. Mitchell," Ethan replied, shaking the man's hand while trying to reconcile this polished version with the stranded motorist he'd helped. "Didn't expect to see you again, especially not so soon." Mitchell smiled, but there was something different about his demeanor, a subtle authority that hadn't been apparent during their first meeting. "I'm a man of my word, and after our conversation I became quite interested in learning more about Carter Farm and its challenges." He gestured to the suited man who had remained a respectful distance away. "This is Mr. Daniels, my associate." Daniels nodded again but remained silent, his attention seemingly divided between Mitchell and continuous scans of the surrounding property. The man's behavior struck Ethan as odd, almost as if he were assessing potential threats in a sleepy farmyard, where the most dangerous thing was Martha Sullivan's overfed barn cat. "Your timing is interesting," Ethan said cautiously. "We've had quite a few unexpected visitors lately." "Yes, I imagine Heartland Corporation has been applying pressure," Mitchell replied matter-of-factly. "Their CEO sits on several agricultural policy committees I'm familiar with. Their acquisition strategies." Ethan stared at Mitchell with growing confusion. How would this man know about Heartland's visit, and why would he be familiar with their corporate strategies? Before he could ask these questions, Robert's voice called, "From the porch, Ethan, who's out there?" Mitchell smiled again, this time with a hint of anticipation. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation with your father. What I have to discuss concerns both of you, and I think you'll find it worth your time." As Ethan led Mitchell toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was happening, something that might change the course of their desperate situation. The question was whether that change would be for better or worse. Robert Carter's expression shifted from confusion to recognition as Ethan led Tom Mitchell onto the porch. The older Carter straightened slightly in his chair, a reflexive show of dignity, despite his worn clothes and the simple surroundings. "You're the fellow with the Cadillac," Robert observed, extending his hand. "Ethan mentioned he helped you out last week." "Tom was it?" "Tom Mitchell," he confirmed, shaking Robert's hand firmly. "Your son did more than help. He rescued me from what would have been a very uncomfortable situation. That's partly why I've come back." Robert gestured to the porch chairs. "Well, have a seat then. Can't offer much besides water or lemonade. We're not set up for entertaining these days." "Lemonade would be perfect," Mitchell replied, settling into one of the weathered wooden chairs. His associate Daniels remained standing at the edge of the porch, his attentive posture suggesting he was more security than companion. As Ethan went inside to fetch the drinks, his mind raced with questions. Mitchell's demeanor and his silent associates suggested someone of significance, a corporate executive perhaps, or a wealthy investor. But what interest could such a person have in their struggling farm? When Ethan returned with 3 glasses of lemonade, Mitchell was engaged in casual conversation with Robert about the history of Carter Farm. The older Carter seemed to have momentarily set aside his worries, animated by the opportunity to share the family's story with an interested listener. "So your great-grandfather established this place in 1918? Mitchell asked, accepting the lemonade with a nod of thanks. "Came back from France after the Great War with dreams and determination." Robert confirmed, a hint of pride breaking through. His usual stoicism started with 60 acres and a mule. Built every structure on this property with his own hands, including the original section of this house. "Impressive legacy," Mitchell remarked, his gaze taking in the farm with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "And now you're the 4th generation to work this land, might be the last." Robert admitted, his momentary enthusiasm dimming. "Times have changed, farming isn't what it was." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually related to why I'm here, Mr. Carter. During my conversation with Ethan last week, he mentioned your financial situation and the pressure from Heartland Corporation. It resonated with me because agricultural sustainability and the preservation of family farms happen to be issues I'm deeply involved with." Ethan exchanged a glance with his father, both Carters maintaining a cautious reserve. They'd heard plenty of sympathetic platitudes from bankers, corporate representatives, and politicians over the years, expressions of concern that never translated into meaningful assistance. "That's a noble interest," Robert said diplomatically. "But I'm curious what brings a man who drives a '57 Eldorado and travels with security to our particular doorstep. We're just one of thousands of family farms facing foreclosure this year." Mitchell smiled slightly, acknowledging the directness of the question. "Fair enough. The truth is, Mr. Carter, I'm not just a classic car enthusiast with an interest in agriculture. My position gives me certain resources and influence that might be helpful in your situation." "And what position would that be?" Ethan asked, his patience for cryptic conversations wearing thin. Mitchell glanced at Daniels, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, then reached into his suit jacket and removed a small leather case. He opened it to reveal an official government identification card with the presidential seal. "My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'm currently serving as the President of the United States. The reason for the minimal security and lack of fanfare is that I'm on what my staff calls an unofficial listening tour, meeting with real Americans away from the choreographed events and media circus that usually surrounds presidential visits." The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Ethan stared at the ID, then at Mitchell's face, his mind struggling to reconcile the unassuming man who had stood beside a broken-down Cadillac with the leader of the free world, Robert, for perhaps the first time in his life, appeared completely lost for words. "You're the president." Ethan finally managed the statement, hovering between question and disbelief. "I am Mitchell," confirmed, his manner unchanged, despite the bombshell he just dropped. "And before you ask, yes, the car trouble was genuine. I've been restoring that Cadillac myself for years. It's my escape from the pressures of office. The Secret Service hates when I drive it, but I insisted on taking it for this trip." Agent Daniels was following at a discreet distance in the town car when I broke down, Robert found his voice at last. "Mr. President, I don't understand. Why would you come here, and why reveal your identity now?" "Please continue calling me Tom," Mitchell requested. "As for why I'm here, I've been traveling through rural communities across the country, witnessing firsthand the challenges facing small-scale agriculture. The reports and statistics that cross my desk in Washington tell one story, but they don't capture the human reality." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "When Ethan fixed my car and refused payment, telling me about your family's struggle to keep this farm, it personalized an issue I've been grappling with at a policy level. I decided to learn more about Carter Farm specifically, which is why I'm back." Ethan shook his head, still processing the surreal turn of events. "So the President of the United States had car trouble outside our farm, and I just happened to be the one to fix it. That seems like quite a coincidence." Mitchell chuckled. "The Secret Service advance team had mapped out my route, but the car breaking down near your farm was genuine chance or providence. Depending on your perspective, I'd planned to drive through Harvestville anonymously, perhaps stop at a local diner, get a feel for the community. Instead, I got a direct introduction to one of the very situations I've been trying to understand better. Robert, ever practical. Despite his astonishment focused on the immediate concern, I appreciate the visit, Mr. Pressy Tom, but our situation remains unchanged. We're facing foreclosure in less than 2 weeks unless we can produce nearly $80 for zero. I'm aware, Mitchell replied, surprising both Carters again. After meeting Ethan, I had my staff research your situation discreetly. Garter Farm has been a productive operation for over a century, consistently adapting to changing agricultural practices within your means. Your current financial crisis stems primarily from factors beyond your control. Predatory lending practices, your medical expenses following the accident, and market manipulation by large agricultural conglomerates. Ethan felt a complex mixture of emotions: validation that their struggles weren't simply the result of poor management, discomfort at having their personal circumstances investigated, and a fragile hope that this extraordinary visit might somehow lead to a solution. That's an accurate assessment, Robert acknowledged. But knowing the causes doesn't change the outcome. First National Bank isn't interested in the reasons behind our late payments, just the fact that they haven't been made. That's where I might be able to help. Mitchell said, his tone shifting from conversational to more purposeful. Not through direct intervention that would be inappropriate, but through an initiative I've been developing with the Department of Agriculture. He turned slightly to include both Carters in his gaze. For the past year, my administration has been working on a rural heritage preservation program designed to support economically viable family farms with historical significance. The program provides restructured financing through partner banks, technical assistance for modernization and inclusion in a national agricultural education network. Ethan's natural skepticism surfaced despite his respect for the office Mitchell held. That sounds like the kind of government program that looks good on paper but gets tangled in red tape before it can actually help anyone. Rather than taking offense, Mitchell nodded. A valid concern. That's precisely why I've been making these unofficial visits, to ensure the program addresses real needs rather than bureaucratic assumptions. The pilot phase is nearly ready for implementation with funding secured and participating financial institutions on board, and Garter Farm would qualify for this program. Robert asked, a hint of cautious hope entering his voice for the first time in months. Potentially, yes, Mitchell confirmed. 4 generations on the same land documented historical significance to the regional agricultural development, and most importantly, a viable path forward with the right support. The initial assessment by our agricultural experts suggests your operation could become profitable again within 2 to 3 years, given proper capital restructuring and targeted equipment upgrades. Ethan exchanged another glance with his father, both men trying to process this unexpected lifeline. Pride and independence had been Garter family hallmarks for generations, but so had pragmatism and adaptation to changing circumstances. Why us? Ethan asked finally, the question that had been nagging at him since Mitchell's revelation. Even if we qualify for this program, there must be thousands of farms in similar situations across the country. What makes Garter Farm special enough for a presidential visit? Mitchell considered the question for a moment before answering. There's the official reason, and the personal one. Officially, your farm meets all the criteria for the pilot program, and this region has been particularly hard hit by agricultural consolidation, making it a priority area. He set his empty lemonade glass on the small table between the chairs. Personally, your reaction when I tried to pay you for fixing my car, you said it was just what people do around here. Even though you were clearly working against the clock to save your own farm, that kind of character placing community values above immediate self-interest is exactly what we're trying to preserve, along with the farms themselves. Robert, who had remained thoughtfully silent during this exchange, finally spoke. This program sounds promising, but what exactly would it mean for us in practical terms? Government assistance usually comes with government strings. Fair question. Mitchell acknowledged. The program would restructure your current debt through a participating bank, not a bailout, but a commercially viable Loan with terms that recognize the seasonal nature of agricultural income. You'd receive technical assistance for upgrading key equipment, particularly your irrigation system, which our experts identified as a critical weakness. And in return, Robert pressed you'd commit to maintaining Carter Farm as a working family operation for a minimum of 15 years. Participate in the Agricultural Education Network by hosting occasional student groups and demonstration events, and implement sustainable farming practices as defined by program guidelines. Mitchell Pores then added, "It's not charity. Mr. Carter, it's an investment in rural America and the farming traditions that built this country. Your family's knowledge and commitment to this land have value beyond the commodities you produce." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching. All four men turned to see Martha Sullivan's weathered pickup truck coming up the driveway, the elderly woman clearly making good on her promise to check on the Carters. After the Heartland visit, Daniels immediately straightened his hand, moving slightly toward his jacket, before Mitchell gave him a small signal to stand down. "Just a neighbor," Ethan explained, recognizing the agent's concern. "Martha Sullivan, she lives on the adjacent property." The agent nodded but maintained his alertness as Martha parked and emerged from her truck, carrying what was unmistakably one of her apple pies. She froze momentarily when she saw the unfamiliar town car and the suited figures on the porch, her eyes narrowing with the suspicion of someone who had seen too many corporate predators circling her friend's farm. "Robert Carter," she called as she approached, her tone suggesting she was prepared to defend the Carters from whatever new threat had arrived. "Are these fellows bothering you? I brought that pie, I promised, but I can just as easily use it too." She stopped abruptly as she reached the steps, her gaze fixing on Mitchell. With dawning recognition, Martha might be in her 70s, but her mind remained sharp, and she was an avid follower of current events. "Good Lord above," she breathed, one hand clutching the pie while the other pressed against her chest. "Your president, Mitchell." Mitchell stood politely, extending his hand to the astonished woman. "I am indeed, Mom, and based on that wonderful aroma, I'm guessing you've brought your famous apple pie that Ethan and Robert were just telling me about." Martha managed to shake the president's hand while still balancing the pie, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, disbelief, and finally a fierce local pride. "Well, Mr. President, if you're here about these good people's farm, you should know the Carters have been the backbone of Harvestville since before any of us were born. Whatever that corporate vulture Anderson told you." Martha Robert interrupted gently. "The president isn't here with Heartland. He's actually here to discuss a program that might help us keep the farm." "Oh," Martha said, visibly recalibrating. Well, then she looked down at the pie in her hands, then back at the president with remarkable recovery. "Would you care for a slice, Mr. President? It's just won the county fair blue ribbon for the 8th year running." "I'd be honored, Mrs. Sullivan," Mitchell replied with genuine warmth. As Martha bustled inside to serve her pie, bringing a brief moment of normalcy to the extraordinary situation, Mitchell turned back to the Carters. "I should be clear about something," he said, his tone serious. "I can't simply wave a presidential wand and solve all your problems. The program I'm describing is real, and Carter Farm appears to be an ideal candidate. But there's a process that must be followed. What I can do is expedite that process given your immediate foreclosure threat." Ethan nodded, appreciating the president's honesty. "We understand we've never expected easy solutions, just a fair chance. That's exactly what this program aims to provide." Mitchell replied, "A fair chance for family farms that have been systematically disadvantaged by policies favoring industrial agriculture." Robert leaned forward, his weathered face showing cautious hope for the first time in months. "When could this process begin?" "Our deadline with the bank is less than 2 weeks away. It begins now," Mitchell said decisively. "I have a team ready to move forward if you're interested. They can meet with you tomorrow to start the formal assessment and application. I've already spoken with the CEO of First National Bank's parent company, who has agreed to a 30-day extension pending your application to the program." The president stood, signaling the conversation was concluding. "I need to return to Washington tonight, but Agent Daniels will provide you with all the necessary contact information. Consider carefully, discuss it as a family, and let my team know your decision by tomorrow morning." As Ethan and Robert walked Mitchell to his car, Martha watched wide-eyed from the porch pie server still in hand, just before getting into the town car. Mitchell turned to Ethan with a smile. By the way, that was some of the finest mechanical work I've seen on a classic car. The Cadillac's running perfectly now. He reached into his pocket and handed Ethan a small white card with nothing but a phone number embossed in gold. When this farm situation is stabilized, I'd like to discuss another proposition with you regarding the White House's historical vehicle collection. We've been looking for someone with your particular talents. As the town car pulled away, the three stunned residents of Carter Farm stood in silence, watching until it disappeared around the bend. Finally, Martha broke the quiet. Well, she said, her voice faint with disbelief. I suppose we'd better finish that pie while we talk about what just happened. Ethan looked down at the card. In his hand, then up at the struggling fields that had been his family's legacy for 4 generations. For the first time in months, the weight of inevitable failure lifted slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something they hadn't had before. Word of President Mitchell's visit to Carter Farm spread through Harvestville with the speed and force of a summer thunderstorm. By sunrise the following day, local news vans had assembled at the end of the Carter's driveway, held back only by the unexpected presence of 2 Secret Service agents who had arrived before dawn to secure the area. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who approached the property, their voices carrying across the morning stillness. I knew. I should have kept my mouth shut, Martha Sullivan muttered as she navigated her pickup through the small crowd. You see, agents recognized her from the previous day and waved her through. But honestly, who expects to serve apple pie to the president and not tell a soul? Ethan, who had been up since 4:30 preparing for the day, greeted Martha on the porch with a weary smile. Don't worry about it, President Mitchell said. His team would be arriving today anyway. The media attention was inevitable. Still, I only meant to tell my nephew David. You know, he works at the bank. Next thing I know, Patricia Wilson's calling everyone in her church group, and here come the vultures. Martha handed Ethan a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Brought you boys some breakfast. Figured you might need fortification before facing all this. Inside the farmhouse, Robert sat at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully reviewed the documents that had been delivered by courier at first light. The packet contained detailed information about the Rural Heritage Preservation Program, including eligibility requirements, financial structures, and participation obligations. How's it look? Ethan asked, setting Martha's basket on the counter. Robert glanced up, his expression guarded but not dismissive. Comprehensive. They've thought through most of the practical challenges facing farms like ours. The financing. Terms are better than anything we've seen from commercial banks, structured around harvest schedules rather than arbitrary monthly deadlines. But Ethan prompted, hearing the reservation in his father's voice. But it's still a government program with government oversight. We'd be committing to specific agricultural practices, hosting educational events, filing regular reports. Robert removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We'd keep our land, but we'd lose some independence in how we operated. Martha, who had been quietly unpacking her basket, spoke up. Robert Carter, you've been my neighbor for 40 years, so I'll speak plainly. Independence doesn't mean much when you're foreclosed. Ben and I watched the Millers lose everything, trying to go it alone. Is your pride worth more than 4 generations of your family's work? Before Robert could respond, they heard vehicles approaching. Through the kitchen window, Ethan saw 3 black SUVs turning into their driveway, followed by a van marked with Department of Agriculture insignia. Unlike Heartland's corporate representatives, these visitors parked respectfully away from the house, careful not to block access to the barn or equipment areas. Looks like decision time, Ethan said quietly. Robert stood with the help of his cane, straightening his shoulders. Let's hear them out fully before we decide anything. Your sister's arriving this evening with her professor. We should consider all music options. A group of 7 people approached, the house led by a woman in her early 50s, whose confident stride and non-nonsense pantsuit marked her as the team leader. Behind her came a diverse group carrying tablets, folders, and equipment cases. Clearly technical specialists rather than bureaucrats. Ethan met them at the door, introducing himself and inviting them inside. The lead woman extended her hand with a firm grip. Nina Jameson, Special Advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture and Program Director for the Rural Heritage Initiative. Thank you for meeting with us, Mr. Carter. President Mitchell spoke highly of you and your father. The introductions continued as they moved to the living room, which suddenly seemed cramped with so many visitors. The team included an agricultural economist, an irrigation specialist, a historical preservation expert, a sustainable farming consultant, a legal advisor, and a community development coordinator. We understand your time constraints, given the foreclosure situation. Eleanor began once everyone was seated. So we've structured today's assessment to be thorough but efficient. With your permission, our technical team would like to conduct a comprehensive survey of your property while we discuss the program specifics with you, and your father Robert nodded his agreement, and 3 of the specialists departed with Ethan to examine the farm's infrastructure, soil conditions, and equipment. Meanwhile, Nina spread several documents on the coffee table for Robert's review. President Mitchell has taken a personal interest in Carter Farm as a candidate for our pilot program, she explained, not just because of your encounter, but because your operation represents exactly the type of family farm the initiative was designed to preserve, historically significant, environmentally responsible, and economically viable with proper support. That last part seems optimistic. Given our current situation, Robert observed dryly. Eleanor met his skepticism with data. Our preliminary analysis suggests otherwise. Your soil quality remains excellent, despite the drought conditions. Your crop rotation practices have maintained field fertility without excessive chemical inputs. The primary factors in your financial distress are external predatory lending terms, medical expenses following your accident, and market manipulation by larger agricultural interests. She turned to a financial projection chart. With debt restructuring, targeted equipment modernization, and implementation of water conservation technology, our models show Carter Farm returning to profitability within 18 months and achieving stable sustainability within 36 months. For the next 2 hours, Nina and her team walked Robert through every aspect of the program, addressing his concerns with specific answers rather than bureaucratic generalities. Unlike the Heartland representatives, they didn't minimize challenges or oversell benefits, instead presenting a realistic assessment of both the opportunities and obligations involved. Outside, Ethan led the technical specialists across the property, answering questions about drainage, patterns, equipment, maintenance history, and seasonal variations in productivity. The irrigation expert, a practical woman named Susan, who had grown up on a rice farm in Arkansas, showed particular interest in Ethan's makeshift repairs to their failing system. This adapter you fabricated is actually quite ingenious, she remarked. Examining the modified pump connection, it compensates for the pressure variation better than the original design. Did you document this modification? Ethan shook his head. Just needed it to work. Didn't think about documenting it. You? Should she advise taking detailed photos with her tablet? Part of our program involves capturing and sharing this kind of practical innovation. Generational knowledge is being lost as family farms disappear, and with it solutions that often work better than commercial designs. As they continued their tour, Ethan found himself cautiously impressed by the team's practical knowledge and respectful approach. Unlike the academic experts he'd encountered at agricultural extension seminars, these specialists asked more questions than they answered, genuinely interested in the Carters' experiences and methods. By mid-afternoon, the assessment was complete, and everyone reconvened in the farmhouse Martha had tactfully withdrawn to give the Carters privacy, though not before making sure everyone was supplied with iced tea and her homemade cookies, Southern hospitality being non-negotiable even in a crisis. Based on our evaluation, Eleanor summarized, Carter Farm meets all eligibility criteria for the Rural Heritage Program. The historical significance is clearly established through your family records and county documentation. The agricultural viability is confirmed by our soil and infrastructure assessment. The community connection is evident from the interviews with Mrs. Sullivan and your participation in local agricultural education over the years. She turned to a new document. What we're proposing is a comprehensive support package. First, immediate intervention with First National Bank to stop the foreclosure process. followed by complete refinancing through our partner institution, Farmers Trust and Savings. Second, a modernization grant, focusing on your irrigation system, essential equipment upgrades and energy efficiency improvements. Third, inclusion in our agricultural education network, which provides both technical support and income opportunities through hosted events and demonstration programs. Robert studied the proposal, his farmer's practicality wrestling with his inherent caution regarding government involvement and the obligations. I want to be clear about what we're committing to 15-year minimum operational commitment as a family farm. Elena replied without hesitation. Implementation of the sustainable practices outlined in Appendix C, which I should note are largely aligned with methods you're already using. Participation in the educational program, hosting approximately 4 demonstration events annually, regular reporting on crop performance, and resource utilization, all detailed in the agreement. A thoughtful silence fell over the room as Robert absorbed the information. Finally, he looked to Ethan. This affects your future as much as mine, son. What do you think? Ethan considered carefully before responding. Throughout the day, he'd been weighing the program against their alternatives, which realistically meant losing the farm entirely. The obligations seemed reasonable compared to the benefits, and unlike Heartland's predatory offer, this proposal recognized and preserved the farm's value beyond mere acreage. I think it's our best chance, he said finally. Maybe our only chance to keep the farm in the family. The program seems to value exactly what makes Carter Farm special, not just the land, but the knowledge and traditions that go with it. Robert nodded slowly, some internal resolution settling into his weathered features. What's the next step, Miss Jameson? We prepare the formal application today, Elena answered promptly. With your approval, we'll submit it for expedited review this evening, given the President's personal interest and the urgent timeline. We anticipate provisional approval within 48 hours, which would trigger the immediate hold on foreclosure proceedings. As the team began assembling the necessary documentation, the sound of another vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. Through the window, Ethan saw his sister Sarah's compact car coming up the driveway. The media presence had grown throughout the day, and reporters surged forward as her unfamiliar vehicle appeared, only to be held back by the Secret Service agents. That's my sister, Ethan explained, heading for the door. She's been away at medical school, didn't expect her until this evening. He walked out to meet Sarah as she parked behind the government vehicles. She emerged from the car looking tired from the drive, but alert with concern. Her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Behind her, a middle-aged man in casual academic attire exited the passenger side, presumably Professor Jenkins, whom she'd mentioned bringing. Sarah embraced Ethan tightly before pulling back to search his face. When I called the house this morning and no one answered, I got worried. Then we heard on the radio that President Mitchell had visited Carter Farm yesterday. Is that true? What's happening, Ethan? It's a long story, Ethan replied with a faint smile. But yes, the president was here, and those are government people inside working on a program that might save the farm. Sarah's companion stepped forward, extending his hand. Professor Alan Jenkins, Agricultural Economics at State University. I've been working with Sarah on potential solutions for your situation, but it seems you found help. From a higher source, Ethan shook the professor's hand, noting the practical calluses that suggested Jenkins wasn't purely an academic. We appreciate you coming. The situation has evolved quickly, but we could certainly use your expertise in evaluating what's being proposed. As they walked toward the house, Sarah lowered her voice. Is Dad on board with this? You know how he feels about government involvement in farming. He's cautious, but considering it seriously, Ethan answered. The foreclosure deadline doesn't leave many alternatives, and this program actually seems designed by people who understand family farms. Inside introductions were made between Sarah, Professor Jenkins, and the government team. Far from being territorial about their proposal, Eleanor seemed genuinely pleased by Jenkins' arrival. Professor, your research on sustainable economics for family agricultural operations was referenced extensively during our program development. It's an honor to meet you. Jenkins appeared momentarily, surprised by the recognition before recovering his professional composure. I'm glad to hear it. Too often these initiatives look good on paper, but fail to address the practical realities facing operations like the Carters, which is precisely why the President has insisted on this hands-on approach for our pilot phase. Elena replied, "We're not here to impose a one-size-fits-all solution, but to develop individualized implementation strategies based on each farm's specific circumstances and capabilities." As Jenkins and Sarah reviewed the program documents with fresh eyes, asking pointed questions that even Robert hadn't considered, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The day had been a whirlwind of information, assessment, and cautious hope so different from the grinding desperation that had characterized the past months. The sun was beginning its western descent, casting long shadows across the struggling cornfields. Those same fields that had seemed like a lost cause just yesterday might now have a future. Ethan found himself wondering what his mother would have thought of all this. Maggie Carter had been the practical heart of their family, balancing Robert's stubborn independence with a pragmatic acceptance of necessary change. "She'd have welcomed the help," came Robert's voice from behind him, so perfectly aligned with Ethan's thoughts that it startled him. His father moved to stand beside him at the porch railing, both men gazing out over their land. "Your mother always said pride makes a poor meal when times get hard." Ethan, knotted throat suddenly tight with emotion. "You thinking about accepting the program, I'm thinking about the future," Robert replied, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made. "This land has been Carter land for 4 generations. What matters most is that it stays that way for a 5th generation and maybe a 6th if that means adapting how we operate." Well, he gestured toward the fields with his free hand. Adaptation is what farming has always been about. As the golden evening light washed over Carter Farm, illuminating its weathered buildings and drought-stressed fields with an unexpected beauty, father and son stood together on the threshold of change. Behind them, the documents that might secure their future were being finalized. Before them stretched the land that defined their past, land that against all odds might remain their legacy. The next 10 days transformed Carter Farm in ways both visible and invisible. Within 48 hours of submitting their application, the Carters received provisional approval for the Rural Heritage Program. True to Elena, Jameson's word, First National Bank immediately suspended foreclosure proceedings, their tone shifting from implacable to almost obsequious once the presidential initiative became involved. The technical team wasted no time implementing critical improvements. The antiquated irrigation system that Ethan had been desperately patching together was replaced with a state-of-the-art water conservation setup that used 60% less water while providing more consistent moisture to their struggling crops. Key equipment repairs that had been financially out of reach were completed by specialists who incorporated Ethan's innovative modifications rather than dismissing them. For the first time in years, Robert Carter found himself consulting with agricultural experts who valued his generational knowledge rather than lecturing him on what he was doing wrong. Professor Jenkins visited regularly, bringing students from the university's agriculture program who approached the farm with respectful curiosity rather than academic condescension. Sarah extended her visit, delaying her return to medical school by a week to help with the transition. She worked alongside Ethan, implementing the new systems, her organizational skills, complementing his mechanical aptitude. In the evenings, the Carter family gathered around the kitchen table not to fret over unpayable bills as they had for months, but to plan for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Harvestville itself seemed to awaken to the possibilities represented by Carter Farm's revival. The media attention following the president's visit had placed their small community on the national map, and local businesses reported increased traffic as curious visitors stopped to see the farm that had captured presidential attention. Mayor Wilson, who had previously been indifferent to the struggles of local farmers, suddenly discovered a passionate interest in agricultural heritage. He appeared at the Carters' door one morning, all smiles and handshakes, talking about forming a committee to explore how Harvestville might become a hub for the new Rural Heritage Initiative. Amazing how quickly people change their tune when the spotlight hits. Martha observed dryly after the mayor departed. She had appointed herself unofficial guardian of the Carters' integrity during this transition. filtering visitors and deflecting those whose sudden interest seemed more opportunistic than genuine. Not all reactions were positive. Richard Anderson, from Heartland Agricultural Corporation, made a final visit. His corporate smile strained as he delivered what he called their best and final offer for Carter Farm, now miraculously increased to 95% of market value. Robert didn't even invite him onto the porch. The farm isn't for sale, Mr. Anderson. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. I believe you know the way back to your SUV. As Anderson departed, his expression, dark with thwarted acquisition plans, Ethan felt a moment of pure satisfaction. Heartland had built their empire by exploiting the financial distress of family farms, never expecting that the tide might turn against their predatory practices. On the 10th day following the president's visit, as Ethan worked with the irrigation specialist calibrating the new system, Robert received a phone call that brought him to the field with unusual energy in his step. That was Elena Jameson, he announced, his expression a mixture of disbelief and excitement. President Mitchell wants to make a formal visit to Carter Farm next week. To officially launch the Rural Heritage Program, they're planning to bring a full press contingent, representatives from participating agencies, and apparently some kind of ceremonial check presentation. The irrigation specialist looked up from her calibrations. That's standard for the program launch. What's unusual is the president doing it personally rather than sending the agriculture secretary. Your farm must have really made an impression on him. What did you tell them? Ethan asked, noting his father's slightly overwhelmed expression. That we'd be honored, of course, Robert replied. What else could I say? It's the President of the United States. The news spread quickly throughout the community. Martha immediately began organizing local women to clean every inch of the farmhouse, despite Robert's protests that President Mitchell had already seen them at their everyday best and wouldn't expect a palace. The mayor called an emergency town council meeting to discuss preparations for the presidential visit, including road improvements that had been neglected for years until suddenly deemed essential. Sarah extended her leave from medical school, again unwilling to miss this historic moment for her family. Dean Williams practically insisted I stay when I told him why. She explained during a family dinner. Said witnessing the launch of a national agricultural initiative that might affect rural healthcare delivery was educational content he couldn't provide in any classroom. As the day of the presidential visit approached, government advance teams arrived to secure the property and coordinate logistics. The farmhouse and barn received fresh paint, courtesy of a community volunteer effort organized by Pastor Stephen's local businesses, donated refreshments, decorations, and even portable restroom facilities to accommodate the expected crowd. Amidst the growing excitement, Ethan maintained a quiet focus on ensuring the farm itself represented their family's best work. He spent hours fine-tuning equipment, organizing tools, and making sure the newly implemented systems were functioning perfectly. This visit wasn't just a publicity event, it was the public beginning of a commitment that would shape the next 15 years of Carter Farm's existence. The evening before the presidential visit, as Ethan was making final adjustments to the tractor that had been struggling when this whole journey began, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Agent Daniels, the president's security man who had accompanied Mitchell on his first official visit. Mr. Carter, Daniels greeted him formally. The president asked me to deliver this personally rather than including it in tomorrow's official proceedings. He handed Ethan a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a vintage car repair manual for 1950s Cadillacs, its cover worn from years of use. A handwritten note was tucked inside the front cover. Ethan, this manual helped me restore my first Eldorado 20 years ago. I thought you might appreciate it as much for the handwritten notes in the margins as for the official text. Sometimes the best knowledge isn't found in the formal instructions, but in the experiences of those who've tackled the problems firsthand. Looking forward to discussing that other proposition tomorrow. TM. Ethan ran his fingers over the manual's worn cover, understanding the message behind the gift. Like farming, mechanical restoration was a blend of technical knowledge and practical experience of following established procedures, while knowing when to improvise. The president was acknowledging Ethan's expertise not with empty praise but with a tool that represented shared understanding. Please thank him for me, Ethan said, carefully rewrapping the manual. Tell him I'll study those margin notes carefully. Daniels nodded, a hint of approval breaking through his professional reserve. The president doesn't share his personal collection lightly. Mr. Carter, he thinks highly of your abilities. After the agent departed, Ethan returned to the farmhouse where Sarah and Robert were reviewing the schedule for the following day. Martha had gone home after finishing her self-appointed task of making the kitchen, spotless though not before leaving 3 pies cooling on the counter. Just in case the president wants options this time, she'd explained. How are you feeling about tomorrow, Dad? Sarah asked as Ethan joined them at the table. Robert considered the question, his weathered hands resting on the polished surface of the table Ethan's great-grandfather had built. Grateful, he said finally, and a little humbled. 2 weeks ago, I was preparing myself to be the Carter who lost this farm. Now we're hosting the President of the United States to launch a program that might help families like ours across the country. All because Ethan fixed a broken-down Cadillac. Sarah added with a proud smile at her brother. Ethan shook his head. It wasn't just fixing the car. It was everything this farm represents. The history, the knowledge, the commitment to the land. President Mitchell saw something worth preserving, not just for us but as an example for others. That night, Ethan slept more soundly than he had in months, the crushing weight of impending failure replaced by the more manageable burden of living up to new expectations. The farm's future wasn't guaranteed. Farming never offered guarantees, but for the first time in years, the odds seemed to favor their success rather than their demise. Dawn broke clear and cool on the day of the president's visit, as if even the weather had decided to cooperate with the historic occasion. By 7, Secret Service agents had established checkpoints at the property boundaries. By 8, the first journalists began arriving, setting up equipment in the designated media area near the barn. By 9, a steady stream of officials, dignitaries, and invited guests were being escorted to the seating area, set up in the front yard beneath the ancient oak tree. The Carters watched this transformation from the porch, all 3 dressed in their Sunday best but maintaining the practical dignity of working farmers rather than attempting to look like something they weren't. Robert had politely declined the mayor's suggestion that he wear a suit borrowed from Councilman Peterson, opting instead for his Goodwill trousers, a crisp white shirt, and the bolo tie Maggie had given him on their 25th anniversary. You look just fine, Martha assured him as she joined them on the porch herself, resplendent in a floral dress last worn at her granddaughter's wedding. A farmer should look like a farmer even when meeting presidents. At precisely 10:00, and the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. 3 military helicopters appeared over the horizon, circling once before the lead aircraft descended, to land in the cleared pasture where a temporary helipad had been constructed. As it touched down, the presidential seal on its side gleaming. In the morning sun, a ripple of excitement passed through the assembled crowd. Here we go, Robert murmured, straightening his shoulders as Elena Jameson approached to escort them to the welcoming position. The helicopter door opened and President Thomas Mitchell emerged, waving to the crowd before being joined by several cabinet members and officials. Unlike the casual traveler who had first arrived at Carter Farm with a broken-down Cadillac today, Mitchell moved with the unmistakable authority of his office, the weight of presidential responsibility evident in every gesture. Yet when he caught sight of the Carters waiting to greet him, his formal demeanor softened into genuine warmth. He approached with hand-extended cameras clicking furiously around them to capture this moment. The President of the United States greeting, the family whose story had inspired a national initiative. Mr. President, Robert said, shaking Mitchell's hand firmly. Welcome back to Carter Farm. Thank you, Robert, the President replied. Though I must say it's looking even better than when I left it. Those new irrigation lines are already making a difference in your eastern field. The simple observation, specific and knowledgeable rather than generically political, confirmed what the Carters had come to understand about Thomas Mitchell. Despite his position, he remained a man who noticed details, who remembered the practical challenges of ordinary Americans trying to preserve their way of life. As the formal proceedings began with speeches from the Agriculture Secretary and other officials outlining the Rural Heritage Program's goals and methods, Ethan found himself watching the assembled crowd. There were neighbors who had stood by them during their darkest days, like Martha Sullivan, beaming with vicarious pride. There were others who had written off Carter Farm until presidential attention made it fashionable again, like Mayor Wilson, prominently positioned for maximum camera exposure. Most tellingly, at the back of the gathering, Ethan spotted Richard Henderson from Heartland Corporation, his expression a study and conflicted emotion as he witnessed the salvation of a farm his company had expected to acquire at bankruptcy prices. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd, and Ethan offered a small nod, not gloating, merely acknowledging the reversal of fortune that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. When President Mitchell rose to deliver the keynote address, an expectant hush fell over the gathering. He spoke without teleprompters or prepared text, his words carrying the conviction of personal belief rather than political calculation. The story of American agriculture is written not just in production statistics and export figures, but in the generational knowledge passed from parent to child on farms like this one. He began gesturing to the fields stretching around them. When we lose a family farm to foreclosure or corporate acquisition, we lose more than acreage. We lose irreplaceable wisdom about the land, sustainable practices developed through decades of direct experience, and the community connections that have always been the backbone of rural America. As Mitchell continued, outlining how the Rural Heritage Program would provide family farms with the financial restructuring, technical assistance, and educational opportunities needed to remain viable in a changing agricultural landscape, Ethan felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about saving Carter Farm. It was about being part of a larger effort to preserve a way of life that still had value in the modern world. After the ceremonial presentation of the program's first grant and the official signing of documents establishing Carter Farm as the inaugural participant in the Rural Heritage Initiative, the formal portion of the event concluded as officials and guests mingled during the reception that followed. President Mitchell drew Ethan aside for a private conversation. "Have you had a chance to look through that manual?" he asked, referencing the gift delivered the previous evening. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied. "The margin notes are fascinating, especially the workarounds for the vacuum advance system." Mitchell smiled, pleased by the specific observation. "I struggled with that for months before figuring out that modification. Which brings me to that other proposition I mentioned. The White House Historical Vehicle Collection includes several significant American classics that require specialized maintenance. We've been looking for someone with both the technical skills and appreciation for historical authenticity to serve as the collection's chief restorer." Ethan's surprise must have shown on his face because the president continued with a slight chuckle. "It's not as unorthodox as it might sound. The position would be based in Washington with regular hours and full benefits, but would include sufficient leave time for you to maintain your involvement with Carter Farm during critical agricultural periods." "You're offering me a job?" Ethan asked. "Still processing the unexpected proposal. I'm offering you an opportunity to share your exceptional talents with the nation while supporting your family's farm," Mitchell corrected gently. "The mechanical knowledge you've developed deserves to be applied beyond emergency roadside repairs. Think about it." No pressure for an immediate answer. As the presidential motorcade departed, later that afternoon, leaving Carter Farm to digest its transformation from near foreclosure to national showcase, Ethan found himself standing once again in the fields his ancestors had worked for over a century. The new irrigation systems hummed with quiet efficiency where he had once struggled with makeshift repairs. The equipment shed now housed machinery, with parts that actually matched rather than improvised substitutes. Most importantly, the mortgage that had threatened their existence was now restructured into sustainable payments aligned with the farm's actual income cycle. Rather than arbitrary banking timelines, Carter Farm would survive to a fifth generation and beyond. Its historical significance and agricultural wisdom recognized and preserved. And for Ethan himself, an unexpected door had opened, a chance to expand his mechanical gifts beyond the farm while still honoring his connection to the land. His simple act of roadside kindness, refusing payment for helping, A stranded traveler had set in motion events that transformed not just his family's fortunes, but potentially the future of family farming across America. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the reinvigorated fields of Carter Farm, Ethan couldn't help but recall his mother's favorite saying, "Kindness plants seeds in places you never expected to harvest." The crop now growing from his unassuming gesture promised to be the most significant yield of his lifetime. 3 months after President Mitchell's official visit, the landscape of Carter Farm had transformed both physically and operationally. The drought-stressed fields now showed healthy growth thanks to the efficient irrigation system. The equipment barn, once filled with barely functional machinery, held together by Ethan's improvised repairs, now housed a mix of restored vintage equipment and modern implements provided through the Rural Heritage Program. Robert Carter stood at the edge of the eastern cornfield, testing an ear of developing corn with experienced fingers. The kernels were filling out nicely, promising a yield that would have seemed miraculous just months earlier. Though he still walked with a cane, his posture had improved as the crushing weight of imminent failure lifted from his shoulders. With the farm's future secured, he had finally agreed to schedule the hip replacement surgery his doctors had been recommending for years. "Looking good," observed Professor Jenkins, who had become a regular visitor as he incorporated Carter Farm into his university's agricultural curriculum. "Your decision to implement that modified high-density planting method is paying off." Robert nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. Ethan ran the numbers on water usage with the new system showed we could support the higher density without risking drought stress. Boys got ahead for practical applications of these new techniques. Speaking of Ethan, Jenkins said, glancing toward the farmhouse, "How's he balancing his new position in Washington with his responsibilities here?" "Better than I expected," Robert admitted. "The White House has been surprisingly accommodating about his schedule. He spends 3 weeks there, then a week here. More during critical planting and harvest periods. Modern technology helps. He's constantly video chatting with Sarah and me about farm decisions even when he's physically in D.C. The mention of Sarah brought a smile to Robert's face. After completing her medical rotation, she had made an unexpected decision to focus her residency on rural health care delivery, splitting her training between the university hospital and the small medical center in Harvestville. Her experiences with her father's health care challenges had illuminated the critical gaps in rural medical services, inspiring a professional path she hadn't previously considered. "The Carter family seems to have found its stride," Jenkins observed as they walked back toward the farmhouse. "You're pioneering a new model for family farm sustainability that's drawing attention well beyond our region." Indeed, Carter Farm had become something of a pilgrimage site for struggling family farmers from across the country. Every week brought visitors hoping to learn how the Carters had not only survived foreclosure, but emerged as a showcase for agricultural innovation while maintaining their family's historical connection to the land. Martha Sullivan had unofficially appointed herself tour director, greeting visitors with freshly baked goods while sharing the now famous story of how Ethan's roadside repair of a presidential Cadillac had changed everything. She embellished the tale slightly more with each, and telling much to Ethan's embarrassment when he was home to hear it. "We're still figuring it out day by day," Robert replied modestly to Jenkins' observation. "The program provided the opportunity, but making it work means constant adaptation, something farmers have always had to do." As they approached the farmhouse, Robert noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck parked